Can we cook and hot hold our brisket for hours inside of our Kamado Joe? Today, I'm going to find out. Hey, I'm James from Smokin' Dad Barbecue, and I'm going to take years off of your learning curve. Knowing when to pull the brisket for the best result is part art, part science, and part years of experience. It takes all three of these to consistently be able to turn out a great quality brisket. But there's a shortcut. The long hot hold is one of the biggest trends on YouTube for backyard pitmasters, and people are doing this in a variety of ways, from setting your oven lower to getting a spare pellet grill to sous vide, you name it. The whole concept is about resting our brisket for a long period of time. But why and where this started actually comes from the restaurant space. So some of the best and most popular brisket restaurants in Texas all use the long hot hold, and the rumor surfaced years ago, maybe a decade ago as I first heard of it, is that Franklin's rest their briskets for 11 hours. And there's two reasons. The first one we always sort of knew, which was just practically speaking, if you have a line of guests at 5 to 7 in the morning, you want to be serving brisket. Cooking your briskets ahead of time is one of the only ways to get a lot of brisket to land at a very specific time when you have guests. But there's a second benefit that applies to everybody, whether you're a restaurant or a backyard chef, and that is turning out a more consistent brisket. Getting the perfect brisket, there's about a 30-minute window margin of error. Before that 30 minutes, the brisket's not quite done. After that 30 minutes, it's overdone. And so figuring out when and where this really small knife edge is going to show up somewhere in your all-day cook is part of that art, science, and experience that is very difficult for the new user to master. But not only is there a secret to make it easier for you, it also solves one of the main problems at the restaurant, which is consistency. We don't want an amazing brisket on a Friday and a mediocre brisket on a Saturday. This is not the way to win the hearts and minds and get the top ranking on Texas Monthly. Instead, you want a great brisket every time, and this means we need to improve our consistency. To use an analogy of trying to find that perfect finishing temperature, imagine taking sort of a small glass and toss a penny into that. That's like finding that exact window. Whereas if we took a massive bowl and threw a penny into it, almost everybody is going to hit that first try. And this means if you have staff turnover at a restaurant or you're trying to learn in your backyard, your chances of success go way up. And your average consistency line, instead of being variable good, okay, terrible, okay, amazing, we're gonna get a much flatter line in terms of a really consistent result. And the way that we are going to achieve that is using the long hot hold. Now, I'm not sharing or inventing the long hot hold method. What I'm gonna share is how to do it just with your Kamado Joe, because there's two main problems with the long hot hold method. First, extra equipment. Some of the most popular methods are saying just take your brisket once you're done cooking, put it inside your oven and set it to 150 degrees. Well, if you're like my oven doesn't go to 150 degrees, it goes to 170. So there's a whole bunch of ways you can try and recalibrate it and trick it to get it down to 170 degrees. But if you take a brisket and hold it in your house for 10 hours, there's this little issue that your family might notice a bit of the smell.
Dad, Daddy smells like brisket. The dog smells like brisket.
So I got away with that once, and that was enough for me to learn two things. First, the long hot hold absolutely does work and make a difference. Two, if I do it again, I'm sleeping outside because the whole family does not want to smell like brisket. So this is a bit of a no-go. So this moves into option number 2 or 3, which is things like sous vide hold your brisket. Well, getting an entire 17-pound packer brisket into a sous vide bag, I don't have a sous vide machine that's large enough. Plus, when you wrap your brisket in plastic and vac seal it really tight, this is not great for the bark being able to hold up. So there's no air breathability with the sous vide bag. And as I said before, my vac sealer isn't even large enough to pull this off. So not only does it damage the bark when I fried it, I have to break the brisket down into smaller portions. And so this is not really my ideal method. Others then have spare grills, like a pellet grill or something like that, where we can set the temperature, leave it outside to keep the family happy, not have to put it in a plastic bag to keep everyone eating it happy. But this now requires a dedicated grill that's just an outdoor warming oven. And this seems like a lot of cost and unnecessary expense just to get this amazing improved consistency and result in our brisket. And this has me wondering, You know, what you really want here is heat retention for a long time, and something that a Kamado style grill is famous for is retaining a ton of heat. So I want to find out what exactly is the heat retention degradation after we close our grill, and does this create enough of an opportunity to cook our brisket, shut it down, and just let it rest inside of our Joe until we are ready to serve it perhaps the next day. So that's what we're gonna do for today's experiment. We're gonna prep a brisket that I want ready for tomorrow after church at lunch, and I'm going to cook it, close the vents down, and leave it in my Joe until tomorrow and see how we do. So since brisket is a little bit pricey these days, I don't wanna just gamble first try and get it all wrong. So I'm gonna do a practice fire. So I set up my Joe exactly as I would do for a double indirect setup. So I put the deflector plates on the bottom, slow roller on top. I would use a water pan in the actual cooking process, but at the end of the cook, there's going to be no water left in there. So I didn't bother to add the water pan for my experiment since it's really not going to change the ambient temperatures. Brought everything up to a heat-soaked temperature that I would be finishing my brisket at, somewhere between 270 and 250 degrees Fahrenheit, and then installed my Inkbird 4-port probe tracking on the grid, as well as one through the top vent to try and figure out where the dome would be, to give me a bit of an idea of what happens to dome temperature versus what happens to grid temperature. And so once everything was heat soaked and stabilized, I closed the vents completely and just left it and started to record the data. Now what I saw there looked like a fairly aggressive curve, to the point where somewhere around the 3 or 4 hour mark, I don't think we would have enough temperature to keep our brisket in a food safe range. And so this had me a little bit worried. So the next morning I got out, warmed up my coffee, rebuilt the exact same fire inside of the Joe and did the test again. But this time I used a number 2 pencil to mark a little bit of width in the bottom vent as well as the top vent, which should mean that our fire isn't extinguished immediately, but instead maybe slows down more gradually. And tracking along with that data, I saw much more of a flat line, getting me a little bit closer to about the 6.5 hour mark. So let me share the data with you, as well as how that's going to help inform our game plan in terms of when I want to pull our brisket off. So let's start with test number 1, where we closed the vents all the way. We started off with about 277 degrees Fahrenheit when I closed the vents. At hour 1, we were down to about 217 degrees Fahrenheit. At hour 2, we were at 188 degrees Fahrenheit. At hour 3, we're about 165 degrees Fahrenheit. Hour 4, we're at 141 degrees Fahrenheit. Hour 5, we're at 122 degrees Fahrenheit. And by hour 6, we're down to 107 degrees Fahrenheit. So if we just connect our dots here, get a sense of the degradation of temperature with the vents all the way closed. That was our first test. For test number 2, started off very similar starting temperature. So I think instead of 277, we were about 280. So just a touch warmer. At the 1 hour mark, we're at 250.4 degrees. At hour 2, we were at 218 degrees. Hour 3, we're at 197 degrees. At hour 4, we're at 175. At hour 5, we're at 160. It's actually 159. And then hour 6, we were at 141 degrees. So let's do our second chart here. And so if we were to start to look at what we want to stay at is above 140 degrees, is that minimum temperature. We'd kind of trace this across till we hit our test number 1. So this is our first test where we close the vents all the way. We're getting about 4 hours of usable heat, keeping our brisket in a food safe range. If we go with test number 2, where we had our vent closed to a pencil width, we can stretch that out to, it actually went all the way, maybe I didn't get my lines here perfect, because that was actually more like 6.5 hours. We got another 2.5 hours. So I'll put the raw data up, but this was 6.5 hours. So nearly 50% more by giving just a pencil width on each data. So now with either scenario, we want to try and guess when to have our brisket start slowing down. And so looking at the meter chart for a couple of previous cooks, I could see the time it takes to go from 190 degrees to finishing temperatures. I was somewhere in the average between 1 to 2 hours. So if I come out to the 2-hour mark, the highest temperature that we are at is 218 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's the ambient temperature. And then an hour later on our more advanced sort of the door open, we're 196.6 degrees. And so using that as sort of the baseline to estimate when I want to start closing the vents, I think that 2-hour window and using this data to say if I kind of do a work back schedule, assuming it'll take about 2 hours to go from 190 degrees to being perfectly finished, that means the grill temperature at that point at the 2-hour mark is going to be 218, and then the next hour it's going to be down to 196. So the air should no longer be heating our brisket and trying to cause that temperature to rise. So we want to try and time the brisket rise and fall with the decline of our two grill temperatures. So that's the data that I used to inform today's game plan. So since my goal is to have this brisket done for lunch tomorrow, doing my work back schedule of being able to try and get a hot hold somewhere in that neighborhood of 10 to 12 hours would be my ideal. I have a relatively small brisket. It's about 12 pounds before the trim, so we're going to be probably getting close to 10 pounds. Historically, at 270 to 300 degrees, a brisket of this size in my double indirect setup is going to take 6 to 7 hours to get to that 190 degree Fahrenheit mark using my meter chart. That's one of the advantages of having a meter. You can go back and look at previous cooks and see exactly what your time and temperature range was. That means for me, I want to start this cook around 7 o'clock tonight. So that way I am adjusting my vents somewhere between midnight to no later than 2 a.m. Hopefully that's as late as I have to stay up. And then we will be ready for our brisket tomorrow. So now we have our game plan and we know exactly what we're going to do. Let's get our brisket ready to go on the smoker a little bit later tonight. All right, let's get ready to trim out our brisket. I picked one up from Costco that doesn't look like I'm going to have a ton of work to do, which is really nice. Since I haven't mentioned it too often, when you're looking for your brisket, the things that I'm looking for is a nice sort of uniform shaped flat. You don't want to have something that's sort of 3 inches down here going down to paper thin, and also you don't want to have a nice thickness flat and then sort of a bulging point, as it will be even more difficult to get those to finish at the same time. I would normally pick something up like that if I plan to remove the point from the flat halfway through the cook and do burnt ends, but something that comes already looking pretty uniform is going to make our job nice and easy. Let's get it out of the package, pat it dry. Okay, so for trimming, I've seen it done a bunch of ways. Some people like to use their slicer knife, which makes it easy to hold your hand stable. But for getting at this silver skin and a little bit of flat on our bottom, as well as trimming it out, I like to get myself a good boning knife. I've got a couple from Dow Strong, and I really like them because they hold their edge. My first boning knife that I ever had after I was done working away, not even done, halfway sort of through my brisket, I already started to lose the edge where I couldn't maintain sort of nice gentle pressure and just get these paper thin slices of silver skin off our brisket. So I'll take you fast forward while I work on the bottom here, and then I'll explain what we're going to do for the rest of our trim. So we don't have much to do. We have a pretty uniform looking fat cap down on our flat, but right here we've got some hard muscular fat that's not going to render. It's just pure white inside here. So let's start to get this a little bit closer down to our point meat. Is that, again, right there is about a ½ inch of just fat. This is great for your burger grinds or making your own tallow. Again, no meat, just pure fat here. This is where a boning knife is just easier to, again, start to maneuver the little undulations that we get on our brisket. I got a small little scalp up here on our point, but that's actually okay for me on our point, as I want to expose some of the point as it has lots of this intermuscular striations and fat. Where I don't want to start scalping things is down here, so I'm going to take a little bit more care, being extra judicious down here on the flat end, but I'll take you back to fast forward while I just get these last few pieces that I can feel by hand are a little bit too thick above our flat meat. All right, this looks good. We've got nice even fat cap all the way around. No bald spots on our flat. Our point is looking good. Let's get our rub on. And I'm going to be doing a bit of a how to recreate some of these most popular Texas barbecue rubs, but to do that you need a couple cooks under the belt. So I'm going to go with the Franklin salt and pepper as well as the barbecue spice rub, in part because Franklin is the first place I believe actually did the long hold method. So that is who we're going to go with today. So we're going to go down first with a base layer of the salt and pepper mix, and then next with the barbecue rub, which tastes a lot like Lowry's, just a little bit sweeter. So it's a bit more citrus and it's not near as salty. So I don't even know if this part has any salt in it. Otherwise, imagine Lowry's, and that is the flavor profile that we are adding here. That looks good. Transfer it to our rack, get it in the refrigerator. So to start our setup, I'm going to place a couple of wood chunks right on the bottom grate here and cover this up with coal. Add some fresh charcoal. Get our Grill Blazer grill gun. Start our fire right in the center, aiming towards the back. Close our dome, let it start to heat soak. Okay, now for the part that's different. We're just starting to get some heat in our dome, but it's not yet passing the hand test. The hand test is where it's comfortable for about 5 seconds and then it starts to get a little bit too hot. So let me show you what we're gonna do different this time. So since we're gonna be burning a hot fire while our grill comes up to temperature, I'm gonna add a couple extra wood chunks right now on top. Since normally what we didn't want to do when we close our vents down and add wood, this is where we're going to get creosote. But since our Big Joe is not yet up to temperature, but we're burning a nice clean hot fire, plus we're going to be adding in all those cold ceramics and everything else, this is going to give plenty of time for this wood just to pure burn. And I think that's going to help add a little bit extra smoke to our brisket, especially in this early phase. So let's grab our deflectors. If you're between the Kick Ash basket and the Kamado Joe basket, this is why the Kamado Joe one makes a ton of sense, is we have these little tabs that are designed to hold the deflector plates, just like so. Looks good. Smokeware drip pan. I'm gonna see if this new larger 18-inch size will fit under the slow roller. It's a little large, I'm not sure. Let me grab the slow roller and test. It does not, so I need to go back to the old size. Add some hot water. Reason I'm doing this is for decades, you read the rumors online, Kamados don't need water pans. And this is true if you put a water pan right under your food, because it tends to steam the bottom of your food and make it really unpleasant. But having tested this side by side, this makes a world of difference, especially when we put it under the slow roller, since we're adding some humidity and we are supercharging it using the slow roller convection. This makes a big difference. That's why I placed my water pan here. The slow roller, which I know fits over this one. Top of our slow roller. And again, you'll be able to see the smoke and the steam coming up. That temperature is, the steam is going to temper those smoke gases, get it exactly in the range we want, as well as make sure that our brisket absorbs maximum smoke in this early phase. Good clean smoke. Divide and conquer rack. Our X accessory ring for a drip pan. If it won't fit underneath, I'm going to use this new larger pan here, as it'll cover more of my slow roller, protect it from getting dirty, and just make it a little bit easier to clean up. Our 2 cooking grids, always against the notch so they can't move around. Our brisket after the dry brine, you can see it's starting to change color, get this nice deep red hue to it, which is what is a good sign after a dry brine, because we're starting to get that salt working all the way in to the beef. And salt, when it's all the way into the beef, it really just enhances the natural beef flavor. So it makes our brisket more like brisket, which is exactly what we want. And I'm gonna leave the top vent open on line number 4 until we start to come up to temperature, and we'll start to dial down the bottom vent and the top vent. But this is going to allow that wood that we dropped in to have plenty of air to make sure that it's smoking with nice clean smoke and doing a bit of a waft here. That smells exactly what you want. This is clean burning wood smell, not wet campfire. If you're not sure of the color of the smoke, always just give that a bit of a waft. It'll help you know if you're on the right track or not. Let this come up to temperature, and then we'll start to dial down our vents. All right, we're working our way up to temperature. This is now a fully heat-soaked dome where I don't really want to hold my hands here more than 5 seconds. So as I was approaching about the 240-degree mark, I put the bottom vent down to 1 finger and then started to move our control tower top over to the 3rd line. Now that it is still climbing and getting really close, I'm going to work our way over to about 1/8 of an inch or so past the 1st line, which should give us approximately about 270 degrees. So I'll let that stabilize, and I'll see you much later on once we have an update. All I'm going to do in terms of updates is maybe a little bit of spray after a couple hours, add some wood chips, but the big update will be closer to about 1 a.m., 2 a.m. when we shut our vents and let it try the hot hold method inside of our Joe. Okay, we are coming up to temperature. Our dome is now heat soaked, like I mentioned, where this is getting to about the spot where that's about almost as long as I can keep my hands on there. So around the 240 degree mark on the meter, I closed the bottom vent down to 1 finger, but now we want to start closing our top vent. So to start, I like a gradual sort of close. So we're about 245, 250. We want to land at 270, which is going to be all the way over here. But for now, we want to start slowing down the rate of acceleration. So I'm going to come to the 3rd line, and then a little bit later on, as it just works up towards 270, I'm going to come to about 1/8 of an inch this side to the right of the 1st line, which should give us 270. All right, it's 1 a.m. Our brisket has just hit 190 degrees Fahrenheit. So I've taken it out, wrapped it in paper, put it back on. So now we're going to close down our dome. And like before, I'm going to use the pencil for a marker, but up top I'm going to go for about 2 pencil width. Perfect. And do the bottom vent. Call that a night. See you in the morning. Well, here we are, moment of truth. We're back from church, so it's now just about noon on Sunday. So we turned our Kamado Joe down into a hot hold oven around 1 a.m. So our brisket has been resting for the past 11 hours, and according to the meter chart, we are still about 143 degrees internal temperature, which is just above the FDA recommendation of 140 degrees holding temperature, internal temperature, for brisket to be food safe. So right now, I think from a food safety perspective, we've cleared our first barrier, but let's get it out of the Joe, over onto our cutting board, and see how we did for a taste. So while I'm sure our fire has gone out, there is still some residual warmth in the grill. It's not reading really on the dome. It's well below the 150 degree Fahrenheit minimum, but putting my hand here, this is not cold ceramic, despite how cool it is, about 50 degrees Fahrenheit outside. It's warmer than that. So let's get this open over to our board and see how we did. I'm so curious. Meet you over back in the kitchen. Well, that's promising. So this feel was absolutely fantastic, but I don't want to get ahead of myself, so let's get it out. Poured some of that extra tallow out of the package back over top. It looks great. Like, I don't know if you can see the jiggle on that, but with hardly any effort, we just have a great bounce. That cap feels properly rendered. All these signs are looking pretty good so far. Let's slice it up. Going with my Dow Strong offset slicer, that's just going to allow me to take nice smooth slices without hitting my knuckles on the board. Let's go for the money shot up here between the cross section of our flat and our point. Oh, that looks pretty good. I don't want to squeeze it all out, but you can tell by the color of that fat that we've rendered everything nicely. Let's get a couple slices. Get a piece. So that is actually, I think, a little overdone. I went to pick it up and it is just falling apart. So we'll get a taste test, but that right now is a little bit on the soft side. See if I can't get a piece of the flat here that I can actually pick up. and it is fall apart tender. I think we've overshot our tenderness a little bit on the flat. Feels great, but super soft. Let's get a slice out of our point cross section here. Oh, looks good. Okay, let's start with our flat. Tender. Despite being a little overdone from our consistency, this is not dry at all. It's one of the juiciest flats I've ever had. Let's move on to our point end. Oh, look at that. This is so incredibly tender. It's like the slightest tug here. We're just falling apart. Let's try this out. Wow. Just like our flat, we've overshot the mark that I'd like for the texture. But in terms of juiciness, wow. So pros and cons of the approach and game plan that we went with today. So let's start with the very beginning in terms of our seasoning profile. This is right on the money for what I would normally season with salt, pepper, garlic, and Lowry's. In fact, from a seasoning perspective, using the Franklin's rub, I can't tell any difference from memory. So the only way to really get to the bottom of this is going to be able to do it side by side. But that tastes just like how my seasoning profile would normally come out. In terms of the long rest and the hot hold, this gave us a couple benefits. Absolutely. That long extended rest, I'm a believer in after trying this today where we rested for, I think it was about 11 hours total. This just gave the brisket time to chill out, absorb some of that moisture back. And in the flat in particular, this is one of the juiciest briskets that I've ever done. Everything else, again, from the smoke profile, adding that wood on top to help amp up the smoke, and our water pan trick. This has just come together like recent best foot forward Kamado Joe briskets that I've done, trying to minimize that gap to something like I might get off of my offset. And so this has worked really well. I didn't really appreciate or notice the difference of trying to add the wood at the beginning, as this tastes pretty similar to other, double indirect briskets that I've done. But I'll again put this side by side to see if that really is worthwhile repeating. But it definitely didn't hurt. In terms of any cons, well, as you saw here, we're taking a bit of an educated guess in terms of how long can I keep a temperature food safe for resting it, and when exactly do we want to stop. And I chose 190 degrees as our finish line using previous cooks and data, thinking that that would coincide with the temperature of the grill cooling down to the temperature of the brisket rising and starting to cool down. But if I go back and look at the meter chart for this one, we overshot. We went all the way up to 211 degrees, somewhere in the 2-3 o'clock in the morning, before the temperatures started to come back down for our long rest. And that is exactly what we woke up to here for lunch today, which is that brisket that has gone a little bit too far for maintaining the texture. So a minimum, I think I need to bounce this back about 10 degrees Fahrenheit, so 180 being the point that we shut things down if we were to do everything exactly the same as what we did today. And I think that would get us much closer to the texture that we're looking for. If you want to see more about my brisket 101, be sure to check out any of my 101 series videos. And if you'd like to hang out and ask questions in a bit more one-to-one manner than these pre-recorded videos, be sure to check out my member section where I go live once a month with members and can interact a little bit more real time than these pre-recorded videos allow me to. That's it for today though. I'm James from Soaking Dad BBQ signing off. And remember, don't be afraid to fire it up.